through it. 21. It seems impossible to give any clear account of the composition of this surah. It deals with various subjects and contains elements from different dates. And of course, if they looked at more into the hadith literature, as it's called, a hadathana is probably closer to the real meaning of it. But yeah, they'd have a lot more questions answered. But the amount of material available to a Westerner, yeah. I mean, there's hadith collections that aren't even fully translated yet, that are pretty significant ones. Hanbal's one is just being released in full in English for the first time, but it's not out yet. That parts of it are Medinan is certain, especially 73, 92, 107, and has probably just been put together finally in Medina. But the main body of the material is probably Meccan, and some of the passages seem to have been already revised in Mecca. Well, Makkah, you know, because that H at the end, right? The beginning seems to be late Meccan, but verse 4 is almost certainly Medinan, and there is a change of style after the first phrase. Verse 3, whether 5 and 6 are the continuation of verse 1 to 3a is doubtful. There's no A, B, C, D, or any of that stuff, but this is how they're dividing it in their speculations about editing or whatever. But verse 6 may be the original conclusion of the passage. That makes it sound like maybe there's a contradiction, but you can't find that in anything of the Quran, at least not in the Arabic. Verse 7 through 10 deal with the question raised in verse 3b, but seem to be earlier. In fact, the passage seems to have been an early one, probably unrhymed, addressed to the Prophet, and to have been revised and made to rhyme already in Mecca. Verse 10 is a Medinan edition. Verse 11 through 15 return to the question of the temporal punishment of unbelieving towns. Verse 6, but the jibing tone of verse 13 suggests that Jews exiled from their colonies in Medina are in mind. Verse 16 through 18 may quite well join to this. The Medinan date of these passages may be confirmed. If this seems probable, they were written on the back of verse 19 to 25. These contain two passages apparently misplaced. Verse 19 to 20 evidently deal with the position of the angels, which is treated of in verse 26 to 30. In this latter passage, however, 29 and 30, dealing with the intercession and accepting it as a modified sense, are almost certainly Medinan, while the beginning of the passage is earlier, verse 19 to 20, we would join quite well to 26 to 28, and have probably been removed from where the addition was made. Verse 21 to 25 are an argument for monotheism, and the beginning of it seems to be found in verse 31 to a phrase in which the pronoun in verse 22 refers. The passage is so constituted at the earliest, late Meccan, or if earlier has been revised, but at a still later date, verse 21 to 25 seem to be been discarded. Only verse 31 retained as the beginning of the sign passage formed by the addition of, well, formed because of 32, 33. These later, probably written on the back of 34, 35, 36, which are Meccan. Well, if people are writing on multiple sides of the manuscript, there's no special thing. Everything was like that. It had nothing to do with, verse 37 to 42, Richard Bell is confused about it. Verse 38 is especially difficult to fit in as stands, and the jibe in 39 hardly corresponds to that in 37. Well, we're mixing the facts, but the later seems to have been added on the back of 38. The original passage, therefore, dealt with the ridicule of the threat of the coming punishment. Even so, it seems hardly a unity, and it might be questioned whether 40 and 41 are continuous, though they have been left so in the construction. Verse 43 and 44 seem to follow 37b and probably belong to the same time. Verse 35, however, though it continues the passage, must be later, and as is probable, the nibbling away of the borders of the land refers to the progress of Muhammad's influence. verse 46, 47, 48, which are out of connection, probably sit on the back of the scraps on which these editions were written. The first germ of the series of stories which follows seems to have been a list of biblical personages. Bill Kippel could be Ezekiel, it could be a Buddha, whatever. Doesn't matter. The fact is that Muhammad's not claiming to be a founder of a religion, so the fact that other prophets of previous times were mentioned only makes sense, right? The stories themselves are having as their climax, for the most part, the deliverance of believers are probably late Meccan, but they have been revised in Medina, as is shown by the occurrence of Medinan phrases here and there. The verses dealing with Moses and Aaron are probably entirely Medinan. Whether 92, 94 are intended to join to 91 is not certain, but it seems possible to take verse 92 as the content of the message implied in the Virgin Mary and her son being made a sign. In any case, these verses are early in Medinan. In verse 95, we return to the subject of towns punished by the destruction. But this is combined with eschatological matter. These towns have disappeared forever, but will be reconstituted for punishment at the last day. The passage may belong to the context of the beginning of the surah, or as the mention of Yajuj and Majuj suggests that it is about the same date. Verse 18, Surah 18, verse 82, and probably to that of 11 through 18. The same subject or a similar word or something is this an odd, it's a way, I guess, but it's not, it forms no conclusion, nothing conclusive to say about this. Verse 104 can hardly join to what precedes and is doubtful if verse 104 to 106 belong to the passage. Well, no, not really, because if it said this is the passage, though the doctrine of the restoration of all things at the end of time, which they contain, would agree well with the sense of the beginning of it, and they may have originally followed. 95 to 98, possibly 101 to 103 were added to 95 to 100 as assurance to the believers, and the scrap on which 104, 106 stood was used in making the addition. Verse 107 to 112 are personal of the prophet and are marked as Medinan by the use of the term Muslim. It is difficult to see in them any connection with the context unless it be that they arise out of the same attitude of mind which prompted the assurance in 101 to 103. Well, we can see out of what was going on why it was better perhaps that some passages waited to be learned, right? And piecemeal in order that you can practice it. And well, there's various arguments, but it is, however, very doubtful if the passage is a unity, even with the reading say, like verse 112, does not connect well with it. And the proclamation of verse 109 hardly seems to refer to what is commanded to be said in verse 108. Possibly the passage has been altered from some earlier form to which 109 belongs. 110, 111 have been substituted for it. Surat Anbiya, chapter of the prophets. You got the levity of the people in face of approaching judgment, late Meccan with Medinan. Verse 4 might be later. So verse 1 through 6 here. Nature of the messenger, late Meccan. 7 through 10. Say or he said, a reading which seems impossible here unless the verse be out of place. Why? It totally makes sense, especially as, this is what they're saying, and this is the response you should say. The people of the reminder, people of the book, well, people who make the mention, not all Sufis are Muslim, but Sufis like to call themselves the people of the reminder. But perhaps with or without being a Sufi, the best thing is to make more mention than you think that you have to, right? The promise of the threat to deliver verified in the event. So Then we go 11 to 18. Example of previous unbelievers, early Medinan. Then 19 and 20, the angels, you know, the unfallen angels, the genderless, loyal hosts, the light beings. And it connects to 26 to 28. But then you have polytheism refuted, 21 to 25. But it, you know, it's linked to 31. And those who raise the dead, okay, you know, the unfolding of the earth. There's no mention of the resurrection in context, but it requires a change of pointing. Merely gives a contrast to 23:4, but a meaning of the verse is doubtful, or the heaven and the earth. Verse 31, okay, that's the connection to 31, you know, the two of them. So the micro and macrocosm. Are there any other gods out there? And you could also think, well, this is the inner reality and the external reality. The Qur'an's rather broad about that. And nowadays, perhaps it might be better to say to think of it in the external and internal realities, right? It running, you know, the town, and there was a proclamation and giving to those. Position of the angels. Meccan with Medinan 26 to 30. As the world unity, followed by 21 to 25, turned into a sign passage with 32, 33. Okay, 31, 32, 33. Signs detached, Meccan 34. Comfort in the face of danger from Meccan plots, 35, 36. Retort to jibes of the unbelievers, Meccan revised. Well, Meccan, okay, how far does it go? To verse 41. And the account of Genesis 1. Well, the Quran, see, this is why it's confused, is because he's expecting the chronological order of claim of the Bible. And, well, it doesn't mean that the passage is confused. It's just not that sort of thing. Everything living. Yeah, different stages of creation, but the Quran does talk about different stages of creation in this respect or that respect. And, you know, there's no hope in false deities, the same time as 37b, so 43, 44, warnings unheeded, Meccan 46, 47, the judgment, verse 48, Medinan later added, and Surah 13, 41 can be connected to the talk about the borders. And okay, the justice balances, the preposition be, with, has been, well, not dropped. This word must be a gloss to balance or vice versa. So see, it can go the one way or the other, and that would make perfect sense with the word, right? That, well, if you think of it in this context and this, then you think of it in this context and that, but not, you know, the crookedness that you hear with others of the stories of religious personalities of the past, probably a fairly early list expanded in the late Meccan time, where Moses and Aaron, Medinan 49 to 51, Abraham 52 to 73, verse 181 of Surah 2, the Furqan, you know, the criterion, the distinguisher. Verse 58, it's taken to be said by Abraham himself, not the people. And yeah, that's what makes sense. Only Abraham or a follower of Abraham would be like, hey, I can outwit these things that you worship. And the Quran being something brought in the face of the people, but it's what's brought in their eyes. But the blessed reminders, the Quran, okay. And Lot, spoken of in 74, 75, late Meccan, Noah, 76 to 82. And so Isaac and Jacob and, you know, the rest, I think we have that they're So Nephila is sometimes interpreted as being grandsons. So we see some of the emphasis talked about in some of these things that, hey, it's not how far the generation is, it's, you know, so, you know, Jacob is the grandson, Isaac, the emphasis after that, you know, so Isaac's the son, and then, you know, Holy Land Palestine, well, now it's called Palestine. In the 30s, it was called Palestine, but it might not have been called Palestine if it was the 20s or something that they had it. So Makadasa, is that how you say it? And they're inverted on the heels, mean non-pulse, probably later, and sensation, they're swung to the opposite view. Although you do see actual volcanic activity that overturned buildings more or less. Not necessarily completely 180, but pretty close in some of those ruins that you see amongst the cities of the plains. Job, late Meccan, 83, 84. Others, late Meccan, 85, 86. Jonah, late Meccan, 87, 88. And though Kipple, Yitches, y'all, it's the Bible Ezekiel, so that could be it. And though Kipple, somebody of Kapil, as a title of one of the Buddhas, this table making sounds on me. So that could be it. Idris as Ezra in 1957. Enoch would make sense though, because Chunuk and Idris are similar in meaning, so it's very and the legends and by legend I don't necessarily mean that it's true or false, but a lot of it we don't know. Psalms like 104 and 190. Oh no, okay, what? CX 148. Brain freeze, not used to the Roman numerals. So they teach you that when you're little. Maybe they don't anymore, I don't know. Solomon understanding. So could refer to things that Solomon had. So certain sources can be given, page 113, which refers to Ethiopic, Kebra, Nagazit for a story of a Persian king, which may have suggested, I guess, what happened with Persian king. Okay, there's something missing from the note here. David, maker of a coat of mails, is probably confusion to other Arabian hero. Actually, no. The fact that David was somebody, David and Solomon with their armor and stuff. Zechariah, Lake Meccan, 8990. The Virgin Mary, well, or at least she's chaste, and she got the announcement when she was a virgin. That's the only thing that's totally certain with that. Verse 91 to 94. Our town, once destroyed for unbelief, is never restored until the judgment day, belongs to the context of the beginning of the surah, are verses 11 to 18. So 95 to 100. Yajuj and Majuj, you know, the resurrected inhabitants, but actually from the height. So the steppes of Eurasia, the Hyperborean people, it's the Hyperborean people, the the Slavic people, the Turks and the Turks and the Mongolian with the Tibetans in between. It's you know, it's those people. So the one side with the Turks and the Russians would be Magog, and Gog is the other side. So Surah 1893 refers to Gog and Magog. John the Baptist, as in Surah 19:7, and childless. So yeah, their family was, they were worried about not having children. And her barrenness was removed. So, but she, aslaha, in the sense of making righteous. So maybe there was some sort of something about her that needed purified in her character before she was to have a child, which does make sense. You kind of want to be purified spiritually before you have a child. The righteous will inherit the earth at the restoration of all things, like Meccan, perhaps originally followed by, connecting to 95 to 98. The righteous will not suffer 101 to 103, possibly afterthought. So Psalms 37:9, 11:29, 34, Matthew 5:5. And the scroll for the books. Okay, the construction here is difficult. Sigil, sigilum, Frankil would naturally mean seal. Maldeck says that it can only be constructed as a person, one who affixes the seal and rolls up the book. The word is, however, taken here to mean the roll or the book, and then necessarily lil kutub as an explanatory gloss. Badawi suggests reading lil kitab for the writing, but that does not remove the difficulty. And the removing of the first creation, the creation of the first, pebbles is the literal for what we have coals here. There's a town restored for judgment, the promise, and there it is. The prophet sent in mercy, Medinan, possibly connected to something earlier, 107 to 112. And there's the variation of the he said, which seems to have been possible in verse, be out of connection, as in any case, very possibly like verse 4. So the end there. Is that the well, some of these things you can use in prayer. Oh, my Lord, judge with truth, and our Lord is the most merciful, whose help is to be sought about against what you chatter. Well, I mean, you can recite the Qur'an in prayer, but you know what I mean, like in the sitting portion or something. Surah 22. This surah is disjointed. Well, it's supposed to have a jarring effect. So on the composition of it, it cannot be unrivaled with certainty. The basis of it seems to have been a fairly early Meccan address, verse 1 through 8, which is probably verse 54, and 61 to 65 also belong. Possibly also Surah's verse 72 and some other stray verses included in the surah. The address was perhaps early revised and added to verse 4 and verse 55, 56. It was later broken in upon insertations of various kinds. The earliest was perhaps verse 20 to 24. Considering the date of some parts of the surah, it is tempting to take this passage as referring to the contestants at Badr, but Qasman hardly seems an appropriate designation of them. It is probably better to take as referring to those who argue about a law without knowledge, verse 8, verse 9 through 11, which turn this phrase against opponents, probably Jewish, and unreliable supporters, were probably inserted still later. Whether verse 16 and 18 date from the same time, it is impossible to say. Verse 25 and 26 form really only one verse, but his rather clumsy construction suggests it has been extended from an earlier form in order to form an introduction to the passage which follows, dealing with the pilgrimage. This latter, verses 29 to 38, have been discussed in the Muslim world for 1933. In its original form must have been composed between the changing of the Qibla and the Battle of Badr. The alteration, verse 35b to 37, which substitutes the slaughter of the sacrificial animals at home for the pilgrimage sacrifices. The Eid al-Adha probably dates from shortly before the pilgrimage of the year 2, the Battle of Badr, having at that time made it practically impossible for the Muslimin to go to Mecca. Verse 40 to 42 are confused Richard Bell. It's not that the verses are confused, they're clear in their meaning and stuff, but and their placement and all that, but it's not how Richard Bell would have it. Seriously, that's how him and the people who worked on this are treating the thing, right? A tentative permission to retaliate by fighting, or it may even be a Meccan permission to emigrate, has been several times revised and strengthened. Its final form seems to be an assurance of divine protection, probably occasioned by a fear of a Quraysh attack, and might date from about the same time, though the phraseology of verse 42 suggests a date near that the Battle of Uhud. That verse 44 to 47 are not homogeneous, is shown by the changes of pronoun. Well, you're changing the emphasis and you're building up an effect or something. That fits well in my mind, but I don't have to believe in it if I don't want to, but I don't see the flow problem. That when you do this stuff that he, that he's doing when he puts this stuff together. Verse 47, in which Allah speaks in the first person singular, is evidently connected with verse 43 and 44, which is the first person plural, is modeled upon it. Verse 44 and 45, possibly to join in the final form, 41 to 40 to 42, but it's difficult to place them with certainty, either in time or context. The same may be said of verse 49 and 50. The surah has in fact become quite disjointed. Verse 51 to 53 addresses to the Prophet personally or out of connection, although they may possibly have been suggested by the change found to be necessary in the pilgrimage legislation which precedes. Well, they're not nullifying any of the legislation, but if, however, in verse 66 to 68, which are similarly addressed, were connected with them, they must have been earlier than that, for the latter passage evidently suggests the form of 35a. It is further doubtful whether 52 and 53 are the same date as 51. The later seems complete in itself and might be earlier, though it can hardly be Meccan. As above noted, verse 54 seems to have been detached from the beginning of the surah, and 55, 56 seem intended to join to it. But 57 to 59 are indeed not out of the quite out of the connection that somebody not reading in Arabic or not knowing the full meaning or not looking at it for itself rather than trying to put it in some other shoes might think. But their presence perhaps being explained by supposing that 55 and 56 was an addition written on the back of 57, 58, verse 61, but then resume the discarded portion of the initial address, which continues to verse 65, 66, and 68, evidently belonged to the time of the developing independence of the Muslimin as a separate religious community, early year 2. Verse 70 is a later addition. Verse 71 may perhaps belong to the time of 66 to 68. The closing address to the believers, verse 76 to 78, belong to the time of the adoption of the creed of Abraham, the middle of the year 2, Al-Hijrah. But verse 78 may have been added somewhat later. And of course, the year where this all is released is 1444. So Surat al-Hajj, chapter of the pilgrimage, terror of the last day, early Medinan address, first 4 verses, Allah's power to revive the dead, continuation of proceeding, verse 5 to 8, 12 is thought to more closely relate to 8, but again, you ever see a TV program, they usually don't just, oh, it's straight like this. You're going to go, to have that more effect. Later edition against the Jews, verse 9 and 10. Verse 13 relates more to 3 than 12, I guess they're saying. Of course, these things are more than just the Jews or something, right? There's a meaning not quite certain. And okay, what passage? The flesh formed and unformed. but the passage evidently traces development of the embryo in the womb, and this clause refers to the stage at which it begins to assume recognizable shape. Because in the womb, you look more like, the further back you go, the more you look like other animals, right? And, you have the male and the female as the difference. And, people reach the old age where they're not knowing what they thought they knew. Bliss of the righteous, verse 14, you might want to connect to Surah 39, that sensual, emotional, psychiatric high that happens. Talk about supporters. Probably later, verse 11, hopelessness of unbelief connects to 41a, so verse 15, part of the early Medinan address, 18 and 19, religious distinctions talked about. Same as verse 9 is where it happened. The Zoroastrians and other classes. See Surah 259 and verse 73. Yeah, it's about what you believe, not entirely about the labels, right? And they turned upon their faces. So there's people, they turned upon their faces after, turning a somersault. Some people are shiftily, a lot harf, on the edge. They're on the fence. Is it benefiting me in the moment, or is, who cares about long term? Is it benefiting me in the moment? That's the sort of thing they say. And so the fate of the believers and unbelievers thought to be later than verse 1 through 8, 20 to 24. Meccans not entitled to the way to the Kaaba after Badr, but relating to something earlier, 25 and 26. Establishment of the Kaaba by Abraham, middle of the year 2. Other holy places in Mecca, verse 33, but 30, continues to verse 34. Any lean mount. Okay, what's that say? So the animal worn down by the long journey. Yeah, just don't give the disease animal, right? The Kaaba is, of course, the house, and the stranger, the Dawi, the Bedouin usually, but there's other people who are not, locals, you could say. And a crooked stick by which animals are controlled. Okay, well, that's an interesting one. Where is that? Oh, the crooks of iron. So talking about the disputants. And verse 3 and 8 talks about how there was contention, because Islam is about dealing with the contention, right? And originally continuous with 27 to 30, 32. There's more than just the pilgrimage. This was talked about in the year 2. So verse 35 to 37. There's an unusual word. What's the unusual word? The uncleanliness. The phrase taken to mean the cutting of the hair and the fingernails is marking the end of the ritual. Uncleanliness of the pilgrimage period. Well, especially cutting your skin is not going to make you not going to remove uncleanliness. You want to deal with the uncleanliness before you cut your skin, and even your hair and your nails, because you think that can go too far and you can get an infection because you didn't deal with the uncleanliness. But your unkemptness is probably the better term, because when you're on the pilgrimage, just like when you're in retreat, you're not combing your hair. And unlike the retreat, where when you step out to take your bath, you can run a comb through your hair quick. Don't spend an hour or prepping yourself or whatnot like people do. That will break the retreat. But if you have a medical condition, you have ointments and stuff to deal with or something. That's whatever time you need for that that's different. Or bandaging and but typically, so they're talking about the trimming of the hair or shaving the head, or like people do at the pilgrimage. And you see me shave my head. I tend to have my head shaved once a year at that time. Will I ever go on the pilgrimage? I don't think so. I certainly, if I have a safe opportunity to do such, with funds properly earned and all that, yeah. But God having forbidden, so there's some forbidden things for the pilgrim, and we can go into that elsewhere. Their sides quiver. Okay. Yeah, some animals in its death throes, but you bring it out of its misery, it can be considered a lawful slaughter. So we don't care about the flesh and the blood. That's just a means. Powerful means, but it's just a means. We're not, and God's not being fed by sacrifices and that sort of thing. So 39 and 40 and 41, we're talking about the approval of fighting and why you fight, aka, to defend freedom and defend places of worship. That's it. Verses 42 and 43, we're talking about the unbelieving peoples. And of course, we're showing a bit of a distinction, because in Islam, there's no concept of fighting people because they're disbelievers. With the different pointing, we have who are fought against in that they, again, they're fought not because they're disbelievers, because they've done things to jeopardize the safety of the house of worship and the freedom of people that practice whatever religion, not just Islam, because that's mentioned, but you have the spiritual oratories and monkeries and nunneries. That's more than just Christians and Jews. The place of ritual prayers, so there's a Meccan jibe, which is responded to, 46, 47, the unbelieving towns, possibly the same time as verse 42, so verse 44 and 45, reward and punishment, perhaps followed by 25 in its original form, apology for changes in the revelations, early Medinan, 52 and 53, possibly later than verse 51, but 51 to 56, but 54 to 56 is about the day of judgment, early Medinan. His own faithful followers, something, knowledge has been given, probably refers, he says it's unlikely about the Christians, but we believe in the good and truth of all paths. So saying that the people of Scripture, even though it's adulterated Scripture, we're definitely supporting that which comes with it, right? So we have the verses as the signs, Satan throwing something in. So the satanic verses aren't anything that was ever considered part of the Quran. Satan throws in commentary, Satan throws in, people acting, there were actually a couple people who wrote down something that the crowd yelled out when Surah 53 was, put there, and they were told to bring what they had. But it wasn't that Muhammad thought that the Quran contained what they said, because what before it and after it and the language involved, it just doesn't fit. It's just not sensible to say that Allah will provide for the immigrants, late Meccan, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61 to 65, still talking about signs. There's a general reference to the Quran, but could refer to the resurrection like verse 5 does. What they're endowed of. Any spiritual truth, any spiritual claim can apply to that, so that's perfectly fine. Actual claim that's true and sourced right and all that. Differences in religion, 51 to 53, like unto 66 to 68, God's knowledge, 69 and 70, enmity of unbelievers, early Medinan, possibly 66 to 68, so 71, futility of taking false things as deities, possibly part of the early Medinan address, 72 to 75, assurance to the believers at a time of the change of the prayer direction, 76 to 78. So 77 is a prostration verse in its original, and 18 is a prostration verse. And so the numbers are off in this chapter, what he lists. So any confusion with that in the original, yeah, the changing the order and the numbers, and are they going to combine multiple verses into one or stretch one out? And it's no wonder why it has not been put out again. Surah 23, the surah contains elements of the different dates. The earliest parts of it were probably two little passages on the signs found in verse 12 to 14, 17 to 21. These originally did not belong together, for they had different rhymes. They have, however, been revised, added to, and fitted with rhyme which runs through the surah. This revision may be late Meccan or early Medinan. The accounts of previous messengers which follow are early Medinan as they stand, but are no doubt founded on Meccan material. The end of the story of Noah seems to imply that Muhammad was still in search of a safe settlement for his followers. Verse 51 to 63 belong to the time in the first years of Medina when he was realizing the differences which separated the Jews from the Christians and his followers from both. The similarity in tone between verses 59 to 63 and the introduction to the surah, verse 1 through 11, suggests that it may too belong to this time, although verse 6 and 7 are later. Verse 64, 65 may be originally earlier, but their continuation, verse 66 to 78, belongs to this time or even later. The earliest continuation is, however, found at verse 101. Another at 79. The fact that this later is short suggests that the original was also short. Verse 101, 102 was later extended by the addition of verse 103 to 113, the two sign passages, verse 80 to 82, and 86 to 91, which of course are not connected and probably scraps on the back, by which the additions, verses 83, well, not that, well, it's always, you know, it's not additions and subtractions, it's that really doesn't, that implies something that's not accurate in anything that the evidence supports. But verse 83 to 85 and 92 to 94 were written, these latter connect fairly well with each other, and with 66 to 78, although they are not necessarily part of the same date, which were, and then the surah includes mention of the prayer, 95 to 100, and it's impossible to say, but it's probably Medinan. So the conclusion, verse 117b and 118, but 114 to 117a is probably a scrap from an earlier date when Muhammad had to reply to the objection to the resurrection based on the length of time the dead have been in the grave. So Surat al-Mu'min, chapter the believers, fairly early in Medinan, verse 1 through 11. And aside from the fact, the point of this chapter lays down that, hey, being a believer is not just saying something, not just having a creed, but this is also, along with Surah 57, a key passage in the denial of reincarnation and giving reasons for that, really. But think of it, if there was reincarnation, things would progressively be getting worse because people like, you know, more and more, oh, I can get it done less, you know, next generation, next, you know, next life. And if anything, that would produce a tendency to make things worse, right? Signs, 12 to 16, Meccan. The extract, you know, the semen being derived from the clay, and while the female also being derived from dirt, you know, because we all come from dirt, and then there's blood and stuff that things are produced from, or they flow to the organs, that the cerebral fluid and all that stuff. Yeah, there's processes to things being produced by the body, but signs Meccan adapted. Oh, slaves, Surah 4, 3 and 29. You know, those they possess. Also, your doctor and stuff can see, but see, it's referred to in different groups. So the guarding of your spouses, you still do that for the doctors, but then the people who are tending to your clothes and stuff, your clothing and your bathing and your medical care and stuff. But slaves, let's remember that Islam has no concept of wars of conquest for land, forcing conversion, getting slaves or treasure. It's not acceptable motivations in the Islamic view. It's cursed motivations in the Islamic view. 17 to 22 are some signs. A tree coming forth from Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, well, actually, there is, a tree that has some relish, you could say, that's produced from it. Olive and or that there's a tree on there's some fruit and stuff produced in the Sinai region. So yeah, saying it's confusion kind of overthrows. The oven boils, like Surah 11:42, an echo of Genesis 7:11, but clearer, something overflows. The flood of Noah, something happened, something came and caused there to be an overflow in something, and the sea kind of foams like something boiling on the pot, or something. So the isthmus breaking with the comet impact around what 9,200 years ago. I forget what date. I have books on my shelf when the ranges that they're looking at for the tectonic, the impact quartz and stuff like this. But the Red Sea became bigger. What the Black Sea didn't exist before that, and yeah. So the ark is in a barge, but not that thing that you see. There was a church shaped like a stereotypical Noah ark, and yeah, that I could walk to. I didn't pay much attention to it when I was by it, because it's like, anyways, an unnamed messenger, early in Medinan, perhaps adapted from the story of Thamud, 32 to 43. Other messengers, Medinan. So Allah, well, of course, the Quran, he said, as in God said, God's delivering the truth. If he told somebody else, if God revealed information to somebody, then but God responding, that makes more sense. Help me. And God says, hey, they're going to regret soon enough. And then there's going to be the judgment, the impact of the truth. Jews and Christians are separate groups, 51 to 58, and going to remain separate. They're never going to be reconciled. The Jews are going to become Christians. They're going to be Christian Jews, perhaps ethnically or something, but the religions are going to remain different. The secure abode of the spring, Surah 19:8-24, rejoicing. So the Jews and the Christians rejoice in their versions of the Moses and Jesus stuff, and other prophets and all that. The good things, they think that in enlarging themselves with wealth and children, that, God's rushing to reward them. No, Islam is not one of those gospel prosperity things. Yeah, you can try for the good of this life, but so believers seek the true good. 59 through 63, God's demands are moderate. 64 and 65, 51 to 63 are related to that. And a later continuation that really addresses, that reaches to responding to the Jews. Of course, it's broader than that, right? Putting like the Jews, like the Christians, and everything, every other passage is not helpful and limits things too much. So 66 to 79, really 81, 82 is talking about adaptations. 83, 84, again, much of the same. Finding the footnotes in this is not as easy. The Quran implied my signs, or perhaps him, proudly toward it, and the discourse. The meaning, however, is the phrase taken to refer to the prophet's opponents plotting secretly, and this would require the plural. Not necessarily. It might possibly mean the one who they regarded as a Samaritan. Verse 20, 87. Because we're talking, the situation of the Israelites teaches the current community. But the Israelites and the Jews are not the same. It's not the same reference. So, like 66 to 78, 83 to 85, 92 to 94, addresses the Christian. Monotheism is argued for in 86 to 91. One's hearts, the understanding. So what you've taken inside, but you're feeling about it too, because you can work on your feeling, people. And what's testified by the prophets, people treat them as enchantments. Well, they're supposed to be moving, but not, they're not, it's not evil spirits working with things, which is the word for magic. There's the claim, the Arabic claim, a prayer to be said, separated from the wrongdoers. Really, 93 to 98 would be that prayer. And then you have death bringing repentance, like 64, 65, the verse right after that, the resurrection and what follows, 103, well, really to the end of the chapter, 118. But like unto 64 and 65. And but it ends 114 to 117a here is given an argument, for the revelation, not being in the sort of time as people are going to pretend it has to be. Because that's what people, that's what creationism isn't the only way to say that God created. It's just a way of saying that God created according to our interpretation. God, the true God, early Medinan, if Allah is a singular and definitive word that all monotheists and polytheists, at least the polytheists that talk about a Godhead or a group of, it's that just in the language. How can you say that Allah is not, the top God or a God or whatever? Surah 24. That part of this surah, usually 11 through 20, deals with the slander upon Aisha, consequent on her adventure during the return from the expedition against the Beni Mustalik, as attested by tradition and accepted by European scholars. Verse 18 through 20, however, belong rather to the legislation suggested by the affair. Verse 10 through 17 are rather disjointed, and probably they were discarded, and the sheets used over again for the writing of more permanent deliverances. The domestic legislation of the surah therefore dates from shortly after the affair. It includes verse 2 through 9, 18 through 20, 22, 27 to 29, 31 to 33, verse 57 to 60, or perhaps slightly later, but may, like the rest, belong to the year 6. Phraseology of verse 1 suggests an earlier date. And after this chapter, there was not even the people of the book were allowed to execute under areas where Muhammad had some control. They're adulterers. So that tells you something there. But there is indication that a guy who was accused of rape, they were going to kill him. So that's a different thing. This heads by tradition and accepted by European scholars. Verse 18 through 20, however, belong rather to the legislation suggested by the affair. Verse 10 through 17, and the sheets used over again for writing more permanent deliverances. The domestic legislation of the surah therefore dates from shortly after the affair and includes verses 2 to 9, 18 through 20, 22, 27 to 29, 31 to 33, verse 57 to 60, or perhaps later, but might, like the rest, belong to year 6. The phraseology of verse 1 suggests an earlier date, so that of verse 21, while 23 to 26, 30 seems to give earlier forms of prescriptions laid down in the latter part. There was therefore an earlier surah dealing with similar subjects, some parts of which have survived here. Its date may have been somewhere in the year 3. A persistent tradition asserts that stoning was at one time prescribed as the punishment for adultery instead of the scourging here laid down. This may have belonged to the discarded form of the surah and have been lost. The verses 34 to 45 are of quite a different nature from the rest of the surah, and a different rhyme runs through them, though to some extent they have been given the rhyme of the surah. This final revision may have been made for their inclusion here, but it is more tempting to suppose that their presence is due to verse 31 to 33 having been written on the back of them. The difference in length between the two passages is, however, against that, unless we suppose the revisions of 34 to 45 were crowded in between the lines. Verse 46 to 56 belong to the time when Muhammad is asserting his claim to be supreme judge in Medina, and the fact that a conflict with the unbelievers is imminent in verse 52 to 56 suggests a date a little before the Battle of Uhud, a date which also suggests the phrases like disease in their hearts, and we hear and obey in verse 46 to 51. Verse 62 to 64, which seem to contain a private admonition and a public deliverance mixed up together, might belong at the same time, but are usually associated with the day of the trench, year 5, a situation which certainly suits the passage very well. And Surat An-Nur, the chapter of the light, in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate, as all chapters except Surah 9 have. And then there's one that has that phrase twice. So an even 114. Introductory, verse 1, legislation arising out of the affair of Aisha, year 6, punishment of fornication, the slander against Aisha, year 6, 10 through 14. Okay. The order's odd. 17. Well, they go this, but they don't have an even number here. So verse 4, evidence must be produced. So the married women, young women of good family, etc. Verse 28, verse 7. Yeah. Verse 6 through 9, a husband's accusation of his wife. And of course, a lot of these things can be applied as well, the accusations against the husband, the accusations against a man of good repute and all that stuff. And witnesses accept themselves. Numbers 5:11. Slanders condemned, because if you don't know, it's slander. So 18 to 20 are like unto 23 and 24, and so there's connection. Forgiveness to be shown, so there's options. But of course, if the punishment's been laid down, then you can actually, it's easier, right? The connection, not certain. 25, like Mary's like, early form of verse 3. So 3 and 26 are connected. You find other passages like that. Privacy to be respected, 27, 28, 29. Modest behavior, 30, 31. The true religion. So the importance is that people turn to or return to the true religion. And the forgiveness shown, Abu Bakr swore to not support a poor relative that took part in the spreading of the rumors. Because one person starts something and then it kind of snowballs, right? But communities need worked on. Modest behavior, verse 31, so year 6. Marriage recommended, and of course, the community is supposed to try to help all their members get married. Signs, possibly Meccan, and then slaves getting half the punishment. Some slaves have put themselves in a position to, be eunuchs, to exalt their position as slaves. Islam, we don't practice this. We don't do this to people. But this is something that, people have done to the, are aged servants. So sometimes people are too young that they don't have that desire. are that they're so old that things just don't work anymore, and they're given some allowances that way. And then some signs follow from 34 to 45. And so there's a simile of the light and the tree, and some make some guess at it. 35a, like 36, 37. Don't say that it was derived from the altar of a Christian church, but it can make one think of that. But people had light arrangements and stuff like this, and they were trying to think of something purer than the worldly light. I don't know, something that could remind you that might have been out there. I don't know. They're not even saying something like that was out there, but so more exalted than what you do in your altars. Here's what's going on. That makes enough sense. Some dislike Muhammad's authority after Uhud, 46 to 51. Obedience, not professions, is what's being asked for, 52 to 56. But 54 to 56, God's promises to the believers, certain times of the day, especially private, like unto 31, 57 and 58. Older women exempted from the restrictions of 31, they're past childbearing age. Eating in each other's houses, modifications 27, so 60. 3 times a day, the before dawn, the middle of the day, after the early afternoon prayer. People take, the radiation's getting hot, it's getting hotter and all that. It's time to slough off. No, that's not the implication with that. But anyways, you take a rest, and for me, that's the harder time to sleep, when it's the hottest. But and it's not even, doesn't get that hot here. 106 is the hottest that it's ever been in my locality. I've lived places where it's got hotter than that, but some places get 140, and I don't know, maybe everything goes dead and you get used to that being your how you get by. A leave of absence, private and public, so 62 and 64, public 62, the first part of it, and 63. And the trial of sedition, that's it with that part there.